Okay, so now we're going to be getting into comparing and contrasting Sherlock Holmes versus the Monkey's Paw. This is basically a literature remix, okay? We're going in-depth. This is going to be the last of the Sherlock in-depth exercises. So it's important to reread the text. A lot of times people don't do this. And this sounds very obvious, but it's very important. So when you read the text and you're a little confused and you can't find the answer, reread the part that concerns the question. Okay? So reread when necessary. Reading comprehension is learned through practice. So if you don't get something, it's fine to reread a paragraph or passage. I've given you the tools to make sense of passages. That's what the in-depth exercises are. They're not going to do this on the exam. Like I said previously, you can always use your finger to hold your places if necessary. That helps people sometimes. Have the text in front of you when we're doing these exercises. And for these, look at your inference log. You're going to find that helpful. Okay, how can we compare and contrast the Red-Headed League and the Monkey's Paw? Again, if you haven't read these stories, you're going to have to for this particular in-depth exercise. So please do so now if you have not done so already. So what clues would lead Sherlock Holmes to have thought the monkey's paw was not supernatural? Cite evidence from the monkey's paw whenever possible. Remember to make inferences. So what we're doing now is asking you to look at Sherlock Holmes and think, well, if he was in the other story, what would he think and why? What were some things that he might infer, would say, this isn't really supernatural? Okay, think about that a second. Look at the text. I'll give you a moment. Okay, we're back. All right. So when we compare and contrast, we need to know, what does it mean to compare and contrast? It's when we select one thing and look at how it is similar and different to something else. It's not just how it's different, it's also how it's similar. Okay? Sometimes we use Venn diagrams. Those are those circle diagrams I showed you before that have a piece that overlaps in the middle and a lot that doesn't, to do this. Okay? So who were the characters in the Red-Headed League and the Monkey's Paw? That's the first question. So think about who's in it. Okay? Sherlock Holmes, Jabez Wilson, Watson. Do any of the characters from the Red-Headed League remind you of any of the characters from the Monkey's Paw? Why or why not? Let's think in terms of the two texts and the characters and how they might be similar or different. Let's say Sherlock Holmes versus Mr. White. Let's compare and contrast. They're both the protagonist in their respective stories, or the lead character. Let's compare and contrast. Maybe we'll think in terms of a word map. That's a good thing to do. We set that up. What are some words in a word map that might describe Sherlock Holmes? Intelligent, logical, eccentric. He's kind of strange. Mr. White. He's conventional. He's not eccentric, right? He's conventional. He's somewhat boring or bored with his own life. Okay, he's... what's another word to describe him? He's superstitious. It's very different from Sherlock Holmes in that particular sense. They're both English gentlemen, right? So that's one thing they do have in common. We know one of them lives in the Edwardian era. Okay? We know they're both in the late 19th, early 20th century. So they have some things in common. Okay, Mr. White, he's married to Mrs. White. Sherlock Holmes, we don't have any evidence that he's married. You see, he has a young lady who has some interest in him in the previous story, which we didn't read in class, but he's certainly not married. He's a bachelor, an unmarried gentleman. Which character is Jabez Wilson, the victim who gets caught up in the hoax, most like in the monkey's paw? And think, who's most like the victim of a hoax in the monkey's paw? It's kind of, not just in terms of the plot, but who's he similar to? Let's think about it. Maybe we might say, like, I don't know, like Mr. White in some respects. Maybe we might say he's like someone else in the story in some respects. Okay? But when we look at going back and looking at Sherlock Holmes and Mr. White, maybe Sherlock Holmes has more in common with the Sergeant Major in some respects. He's very adventurous. Okay? I don't know. Think about it. You might do a word map for him as well. So what was the hoax in the Red-Headed League? Who was its victim? Is there a hoax in the monkey's paw? Who was the victim of the hoax in the monkey's paw? Okay? So those are some things to think about. Think about that overlap. We were just talking about that before. Okay, Jabez Wilson was the victim of the hoax in the Red-Headed League, right? That's who the victim was. Is there a hoax in the monkey's paw? Well, I don't know. Now that I'm thinking about it from Sherlock Holmes' perspective, maybe there is. Maybe this monkey's paw is some sort of chicanery or some other nonsense. So who's the victim of the hoax? I don't know. Mr. White, Mrs. White? There weren't that many characters in the story, so we might say one of them. We might not. So comparing and contrasting literary elements. We're going beyond the plot. This is going to another depth where we start talking about how is the style of writing, how is metaphor used differently in one than the other, how are similes, how is genre used, and tone. We address tone a little bit, but are the genres of the stories similar or different? How do we know that? Okay, and now we're getting into the literary elements. Horror tends to have a lot of foreshadowing. Remember, we had foreshadowing in the monkey's paw from the very first line. It was a dark and stormy night, or whatever the case may be. You could look back at your text and find it. Okay, that's something that happens in horror a lot. So we may be able to figure that out from the literary techniques, not just the story. Okay, but the genre matters. The genre of the Red-Headed League is a mystery. That's very different than a horror story. Okay, there's a lot of other things too. What's the point of view? What's the point of view of the characters? We talked about this a little before. Okay, Sherlock Holmes' point of view is logical. He wants to solve the mystery. Point of view of Mr. White is primarily motivated by fear. When we think about what's the motivation, Sherlock Holmes' motivation as a character may be earning a salary, curiosity. Mr. White's motivation may be curiosity too, to some level, because he wants an adventure, but it's also fear. Okay? The supernatural and the reasonable. We just talked about this a little bit, but what does Mr. White believe about the supernatural? Making an inference. What does Mr. White believe about deduction? Now he's taking at face value this story of a monkey's paw. He's grasping it desperately at the end when he thinks his son might be a zombie knocking feverishly at the door. So he believes in the supernatural, right? We can make an inference. They never state what wish he makes, but we made an inference that wish that was that his son was no longer alive again because he thinks he's a zombie. Okay, what does he believe about deduction? Well, I don't know. Because what do you think? He doesn't seem to be thinking about correlation and causation and cause and effect, okay, which are things we discussed. What does Sherlock Holmes believe about deduction? We know what Sherlock Holmes believes. He's pretty gung-ho about deduction from a lot of those quotations we have. And you could look at the specific text for certain things. He's going to look for a reasonable answer. Not necessarily, he won't settle for an outlandish answer or a supernatural answer. So what does he believe about the supernatural? Think about that. It never specifically says it. Since he believes in reason and science and deduction, probably less likely to believe in that. Okay? So for reinforcement in your notebook or on Blackboard, write a conversation between Sherlock Holmes and Mr. White from The Monkey's Paw about whether or not the monkey's paw was supernatural. 3 sentences from each character. Either Do it on the Blackboard forums if you're taking the Blackboard version of the course, or do it in your notebook if you're taking the YouTube version. Okay? And that's it for this time, and it's the end of that Sherlock Holmes in-depth exercise. I hope you enjoyed the Red-Headed League. I certainly did. And I'll see you next time.